Jesus had no enemies.
Jesus did have enemies.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Thank you, Mark. And I would also like to welcome you to today's program. We're so very glad you've tuned in, especially for this subject, this program. We're talking about, should we have enemies? That's the question. But before we get started into our discussion, I'd like for you to meet our panelists for today. Let's begin with the gentleman to my right.
I am Bishop Michael Olson, and I am the Bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Fort Worth.
I'm Rabbi Phil Bentley, retired, living in Hendersonville, North Carolina.
I'm Tom Plumley. I'm a minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I serve as the senior minister at First Christian Church, Fort Worth, Texas.
And I'm Andrea Luxton. I'm president of Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan, which is affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
My name is Othel Hawthorne Lakey. I'm a bishop in retirement of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church residing in Buford, Georgia.
My name is Canon John Peterson. I am an Episcopal priest and I'm canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, District of Columbia.
Well, thank you very much. As you heard, and as you can see, we've covered the nation pretty well. We come from all corners of the states. There may be a place or two that we haven't covered, but we're so glad that you were able to be here today. Appreciate your presence and your willingness to participate in today's discussion. Let's begin, shall we? It seems easy to have enemies these days, though that has probably been the case in every age of human existence. It does seem to be very much a part of our existence. Indeed, the argument could be made that our enemies define us. It has become a cliché that we stoke our ire against each other by scrupulously watching and reading only those with whom we already agree. And they, of course, share our understanding of who are the, quote, bad guys, who is the enemy. However, what does it mean to our faith when we have enemies? What are we supposed to do with or to our enemies? Jesus, for instance, had opposition, even deadly opposition. Nevertheless, would he have called them enemies? There are three questions I'd like for our panelists to consider today regarding the subject. First of all, should people of faith have enemies? Second question, is there a sense in which people of faith can regard ideas or abstract concepts like unbelief or selfishness as enemies without naming people as enemies? And then finally, if one assumes that people of faith can or indeed should have enemies, what then is appropriate behavior with respect to those enemies? Well, that is our subject for today, and we're going to go to our panelists. And before we hear from each one of them, we want to go back to those who helped to begin the program by making opening statements. And for that, we're going to go back over to Tom Plumley and then Michael. So, Michael Olson. So, Tom Plumley, you're first.
Thank you. Perhaps we're splitting hairs here today, but I made the statement that Jesus had no enemies in the sense that I think Jesus considered no one an enemy. Certainly, there were people who opposed him, people who killed him, people who beat him, people who apparently enjoyed the fact that that had happened to him. But I think having enemies is something that happens within our own understanding. And he would not have understood anyone as an enemy in the sense that they were someone not worthy of any sort of action, reaction, or behavior other than something that is punishing or destructive of them. He said, even on the cross, he prayed for those who did not know what they were doing when they hung him up there. And the reason I think this is important, I think this is a critical issue in an age in which we seldom engage each other constructively, and prefer instead regularly and sometimes without ceasing, simply to spew venom all over each other, to regard each other as enemies, and to treat each other with destructive motivations. That's why I think it's important that we discuss this whole notion of enemies here today. And I think that I just want to begin by quoting the man who said that we are to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us.
Thank you very much. Now, Bishop Olson, further thoughts on the subject?
Well, I'd like to pick up where he left off, and that's Jesus said, "Love your enemies." And incumbent upon that is somehow someone's an enemy. That's a response to it. I think, and coming from the firm tradition that says hairs are meant to be split as well as combed, the point is I think is precisely that, is that anyone in the long prophetic tradition of Judaism had enemies. Anyone who calls conversion to the status quo, who speaks for those who are suffering from the imbalance or oppression, is going to have powerful enemies. And Jesus gives, I think, an instruction to us as far as to pray for them. And precisely that is what leads to reconciliation and peace, and not just simply an uneasy truce of self-interest. I think that it's important for us, especially today, in a society and in a culture that is just very angry for the sake of being angry, and looks for excuses and looks for scapegoats to blame, and not even scapegoats, just is always on the offensive in an offensive way. For us to really, again, turn to prayer, but acknowledge that, if there's anything of substance that we believe, it's going to bring opposition, but we have to love our enemies, and in loving and praying for our enemies, we too are converted.
Thank you very much. Rabbi Bentley, welcome back to the program. Good to have you here again today. Your thoughts on the subject, please.
When I was 20 years old and already very outspoken on peace and justice, a rabbi who knew me well said to me, "Phil, you're going to make all the right enemies." And because people of faith who speak truth will have some who consider them enemies. They discomfort them. However, I also have learned, and this is quoted in the Talmud as one of the important sayings in the book of Proverbs: "Do not gloat when your enemy falls. When they stumble, do not let your heart rejoice. For the Lord will see and disapprove and turn his wrath away from them." And then in the next chapter, it says, "If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will heap live coals, burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you." And that, by the way, is quoted in the New Testament in Romans. So my whole take on this is, yes, if you do right and say right, you cannot help but create enemies, but you must listen to them and try to stop them being enemies.
All right, thank you very much. Bishop Lakey, welcome to the program. Your thoughts on the
Thank you
subject.
very, very much. This is I didn't think when I looked at it, it was going to be much of a program. I said, "Oh, this is going to be a waste of time," but I see it's not that at all. In fact, the issue is, and I thank Tom for bringing this up, at what point in our society does any opposition, any differences, if you please, become a mortal enemy almost? At what point that, and here we sit around this table and we flesh it over, but look at us now. Here's a Jewish rabbi, a rabbi, and a Roman Catholic bishop, and a Seventh-day Adventist, and an Episcopal, and here's a disciple of Christ, And here's a black Methodist? Now, how in the world did we get around this table when at one point we were all at some odds with each other? Because we learned over the course of history that differences of opinion, differences of even our approaches to God, does not make us, quote, enemies. So we must learn, as Jesus taught us, to look at people and accept all of us as children of God, who in our approach to God and human existence, we approach it differently. And the way you do it, the way I do it, does not necessarily make us enemies.
All right, thank you very much. Now, Dr. Luxton, welcome to the program. Your thoughts, please.
Thank you. You know, when I was kind of young, just kind of a young leader, and my boss at that time was in a very difficult situation and was getting an awful lot of hate, a lot of stuff targeted at him, thrown in his face, written, verbal. And, you know, I was just rising up in just anger against those who were treating him that way. And one day I said to him, how do you do this? You know, getting all this stuff thrown at you, and I've never seen you hit back verbally in any way at all. And he said, you know, what I've learned is this, is that when someone gets at me, treats me like they're my enemy, it's like a switch now goes in my head and my mind says, huh, what can I do to help them understand what's going on here? And he said, just by that switch of thinking about them, he found himself able to cope with the situation, and it helped him navigate through some extremely difficult situations. So I really do think that someone wants to be an enemy to us, but we don't have to accept that anger. We don't have to let it destroy us. Now, having said that, I think there are times when it doesn't matter how much you talk to someone, how much you try and understand, how much you try and listen. I think there are times when that anger and that hatred and the enmity is just going to continue. What do you do at that point? I still don't think you should head back, but I think there's times when you have to say, I'm sorry, I can't go where you're going. And you have to keep on going where you need to go, and accept the results of that. But I think a lot of it starts with our attitudes towards people. That can help an awful lot, I think, frame where things go.
What you said reminded me of the turn the other cheek advice and counsel that we find in Scripture.
Yep.
Canon Peterson, your thoughts on the subject, please.
Yes. This title of this show is extremely interesting. Should we love our enemies? I cannot imagine 10 years ago, when I first joined the American Religious Town Hall team, that we would ever be discussing such a topic, how times have changed. Today, in our extremely polarized political society, enemy is a common word that is thrown around very easily to describe any person who does not agree with what I believe. For Democrats, Trump is seen by many as the enemy. For Republicans, it is Nancy Pelosi or Elizabeth Warren who is seen as the enemy. We've really today in our own society, we've really lost all civility. And hence today we have a program titled, Should We Have Enemies? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, the new lawgiver, gives this word, building upon Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus gives a new law in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. While Jesus is quoting Leviticus, he only quotes the very last part of that verse. In the first part of the verse, it says, do not hate anyone of your own kin. You shall reprove your neighbor. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people. Now, I would certainly like to hear the rabbi give his understanding of this text. For is it just our own family network that we do not hate or have an enemy with, or is it a much broader sphere? Richard Friedman from the University of Georgia has made the most compelling argument that, that this understanding of neighbor means all of humankind.
Rabbi, would you care to respond to that?
Well, Richard Friedman said it, and I know him, and it's very good. It's definitely, I believe that underpinning all of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is the belief that all human beings are one family. And the general thing that we have, I'm going to read a quote from the Quran briefly. The Quran, same as us. Not equal are the good deed and the bad deed. Repel evil by that which is better, and then the one who is hostile to you will become as a devoted friend. But none is granted it except those who are patient, and none is granted it except one having great fortune. So this is a universal belief about a universal humanity, family of man, of humanity.
All right, thank you. Reverend Plumley, your further comments, please.
Yeah, I guess I want to use myself as an example and try to think through the way I view, let's say, the white power movement, okay? The white nationalists in this country or in any country. You know, there's a point at which I don't ever want to be heard to say there are some good people in that group, as our president did. And yet, maybe he was more wise than I think he was, because there are just a lot of folks that turn to that ideology because they are anxious white men concerned about the loss of hegemony within the larger society. Okay? Now that doesn't excuse away their attitudes or their hatreds or certainly behaviors that harm others. But that does give me an opportunity to look at them differently. Therefore, I want to ask myself, and as I do that, ask everyone to examine themselves to see if there's not a way to look differently at the person that I think is just so blasted awful. Particularly in these days, particularly in these times, when we are finding ourselves just almost at the point of civil war, just ready to take up arms against each other in the minds of some people.
Okay, Bishop Lakey, you wanted to add some comments here.
Well, it's difficult to talk about loving white nationalists when the Ku Klux Klan wants to lynch me. Sure. Now, though we can love individually, we must remember that the ideal of love is the Christian ideal. More than that, it's a human ideal. You wind up on crosses, or you wind up on a lynch rope. And so we have to define what we mean by enemies. There's a difference in me arguing a theological point with Tom Plumley and him or anybody his color shoots me because I walk down the street because of the color of my skin. So I can love all I want to, but at some point, justice has to come into the picture. And I mean God's justice, not our perceptions of justice. So to say we don't have enemies negates the entire thrust of there's an evil power at work in this world.
But there is the case of reacting to the enemy. What is the appropriate response to those who wish ill or perpetrate ill will toward us? That is perhaps, again, looking at it from Jesus' perspective, he allowed himself to be hanged upon a cross There he was persecuted, he was afflicted, he was tortured, and he died. So in our responses, how do we respond to the things you've described? Bishop Olson.
I think we're saved by the truth ultimately, and we're always striving to find the truth, and the truth is revealed to us. And I think with that is that it's true that there are enemies, but it's also true that there is prayer and there's reconciliation and there's a willingness to be reconciled. I think denial leads to appeasement and comfort with evil, which is evil itself.
All right. Yes, and then Canon Peterson.
I found it
We're
very interesting.
Just a
what
few
you,
seconds.
You just said, because Jesus, of course, was crucified because of political and religious authorities being in opposition to him. I mean, Jesus didn't say, "Oh, I want to be crucified today. This is going to be a nice event." No. It was because he was convicted and crucified by political and religious authorities.
And that's going to have to be the last word for this particular segment. Thank you so much for staying by. There is an announcement I'd like for you to hear at this moment. We'll be back in just a little while.
Thank you, Pastor Lutz. We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you, Pastor Lutz, and today's closing statements.
Thank you and welcome back. I hope you take some time to drop us a line. You can go to the website there that Mark talked about. You can view programs that we've archived for you, programs from the past I'm sure you'll find very interesting. Or send us a letter. You have our address. We're looking forward to hearing from you. We get some great suggestions concerning what kinds of programs you'd like to see here at the American Religious Town Hall. We're going to go now to our summations. Let's begin with Bishop Olson.
To say that Jesus had enemies is not to say that he had hatred or enmity in his heart towards others. What it is to say is that he preached a gospel of conversion that threatened those who were complacent with evil and accepted the status quo of oppression. We must always look at our own self as far as who are our enemies, but more importantly, how do we respond to those who oppose us? Do we pray for them, or do we return hatred for hatred?
Thank you very much. And then Reverend Plumley, your summation, please.
Thank you. I appreciate that phrase, Bishop Olson, being complacent with evil. We certainly are not to do that. I am struck, however, by the fact in our faith, the faith that we all share around this table anyway, that all are bearers of the image of God. And it is that part of them that I am called to address. And it is that part of them that I am called to honor. And perhaps by learning to do that more frequently, we can find a way for reconciliation in this world.
Thank you very much. Bishop Lakey.
Thank
your
you very
summation.
much. When I think of this matter of enemies, I'm reminded of that saying by James, I think James Russell Lowell, who said, "Truth forever on the scaffold and wrong forever on the throne." It's that, yet that scaffold sways the future, and beyond the dim unknown stands God, keeping watch over his own.
Thank you, and for being here today. And then Canon Peterson, your summation.
Yes, I'm actually going to pick up on the phrase that I was planning to say, that Tom has just spoken about, being created in the perfect image of God. And how does one live in that perfect image of God, having enemies? How do we respond as a person, as all people are created in the perfect image of God? How do we respond in that image by having enemies. It seems to me to be a contradiction of terms. I would go back once again to what we spoke a couple of weeks ago in this program about the law and how the law is to be interpreted. And I believe that here we are given the opportunity to indeed love your neighbor. And what does that mean for us today? And how are we going to do that, particularly when there are people who are willing to kill us, willing to kill because they're in disagreement with us?
All right, thank you for your participation today. Dr. Luxon, your summation.
One of the items in the program, when we started, that we haven't really talked about is, can enemies be abstract concepts? And I'm not sure I want to talk about it as an abstract concept, but let's talk about white nationalism. I'm not sure that's totally abstract. It's actually quite concrete. And yes, I think those are our enemies. And I think that sometimes our rhetoric and our defense needs to be against some of those concepts and ideas that drive people, rather than our anger being turned against the people. The people are not so much our enemies, but what they believe is our enemies.
All right, thank you very much. Rabbi Bentley, your summation, please.
My attitude toward the whole problem of enemies is from a philosophy called compassionate listening, which says that an enemy is someone whose story you have not heard. So listen to them, make sure they know you are listening, and turn enemies into friends. Or as the ancient rabbis said, who is heroic? One who can turn an enemy into a friend.
Thank you very much. This has been a very enlightening and insightful discussion. So thank you. Appreciate your being here today. And we're so glad that you've tuned in today. We hope that you've learned something. And by the way, I'll encourage you to tell your friends about the town hall. Perhaps you have people who don't in your life that don't even know about this program because you haven't shared with them about this program. So I'd encourage you to do that. We always welcome new viewers. But for now, the Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America, we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. So now, friends, until next week at the same time and over this very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. And may the God of all of us bless all of you.